This podcast is supported by Wesleyan Financial Services, providers of specialist financial advice to members of the legal profession. Wesleyan's team of dedicated experts have been helping law firms and their employees achieve financial well-being over many years, providing personal and commercial financial advice, in-firm seminars and online guidance. Strategic partners with the Law Society, Wesleyan is proud of its partnership with Women in the Law UK. For more information about Wesleyan, visit wesleyan.co.uk, or to arrange a financial education event in your firm or a no-obligation financial health check, connect with Sarah Deacon, Wesleyan Area Manager, on LinkedIn.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni, a barrister based in Manchester at Kenworthy's Chambers and a joint vice chair of the Association of Women Barristers. I'm also the founder of Women in the Law UK, an organisation which is passionate about supporting the next leaders in law. We put on regular events, host masterclasses and also enjoy an annual dinner and conference. Do come and learn more about what we do at womeninthelawuk.com. You could also connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Find us on Twitter at Women in the Law UK. On this episode, I'll be talking law to Chris Daw QC. After being called to the bar in 1993, Chris built his reputation acting in high-profile trials dealing with serious organised crime and commercial fraud. He was appointed Queen's Counsel in 2013 and now acts in a broader range of matters whilst maintaining a substantial criminal practice. As we recorded this interview during the lockdown for COVID-19, please forgive our audio quality as we held all the interviews remotely. Chris started by telling me more about his work.
So as you say, I've been a QC now for 7 years. I've been practicing for over 25 years at the bar. I practice mostly in the fields of sort of serious and complex crime, fraud, business crime, etc. I also act for a lot of sort of celebrity clients, footballers and people in the entertainment business. So I spread myself all over the country. I'm in chambers in London at Sergeant's Inn on Fleet Street and also at Lincoln House, which is one of the leading chambers for sort of criminal and fraud work outside London, based in Manchester. But I, like most QCs, I go where the cases are. And also travel overseas a fair bit. I've had cases in the last year took me to Ghana and all sorts of other places. So I'm very lucky. I have a very interesting and varied practice, and I really enjoy the job.
For you, why did you go into law?
It's a really good question, that, because I grew up sort of from a sort of working class background. My dad was a builder, and I didn't have anyone that had been to university, let alone anyone who'd qualified as in one of the professions. So growing up, I didn't sort of have that as part of my world. I went to a sort of very ordinary comprehensive school in Milton Keynes, and there were low aspiration levels for most of the students and the pupils there. So really, it was an entirely burst of luck that hit my life, because when I was 16, I decided to leave home, and my life ambition was to leave school and go and sell donuts and cans of Coke on the beaches of the south of France. I hitchhiked there with a friend of mine. It took us, a while to get there. And I don't know if you've ever wandered up and down a beach with a backpack on full of cans of Coke and ice, and it's pretty heavy and it's very hot. And to be honest with you, at 16, I drank more of the stock than I sold and ate more of the donuts than I sold. And it was not destined to be my financial future. So I ran out of money after about a month and came back to England, managed to sort of somehow hitchhike and get my way back to England. But when I got back, my mum and dad had moved 200 miles away to another house, a much smaller house, because I'd left home. So, there wasn't really the need for a bigger house. They moved to a much smaller house. But anyway, they did have a little tiny back bedroom that they let me sleep in. But really, that was the best thing that they could have done, because as it happened, they moved about a mile away from a state sixth form college, which was, at the time and still is, one of the best in the country. And I managed to get in, even though I'd done really badly in my exams at 16, because I've kind of had this ambition to go to the beach, and hadn't really done any work. but they let me into this college, and I ended up just being inspired by the teachers. And to answer your question, which was why did I decide to become a barrister, I did the careers test at the sixth form college, which was even then was computer based. So you had to say, I like this or I don't like that. And I filled it all in, and it came back and said there's only 2 jobs that you could possibly do, and one was actor and the other one was barrister. I wasn't really a very good actor. I did a bit of acting in the school like productions or the college production stuff. I wasn't very good at that. So this is what happened, Sally. I went to the Crown Court in Liverpool, which was not far from where my parents had moved to, and I sat and watched a trial for about a week, which was to do with bringing drugs in via the docks in Liverpool. And I was 16 years old, maybe 17 by then, because it would have been the summer holidays of my halfway through my A levels. And I just thought, wow, this is just like, can you really do this as a job? And there's these people dressed up, and it's all dramatic, and there's all the family watching in the public gallery, and they're all going, oh, when someone says the wrong thing. And then eventually there was the verdict, and I was just like, we've all watched verdicts on trials on TV, everybody has. But this was like, wow, this guy's going to go down for 20 years or he's going to go home. And I just thought that to be part of that is just, wow, you can do that as a job. And by that stage, because I was going somewhere that was, focused on more on qualifications and A-levels and encouraging you to kind of apply to university, I spoke to the careers teacher and I said, look, this is just fallen in love with this thing. I bought every law book I could find. I bought every magazines. I'd read read law reports in The Guardian about bloody housing cases. That just because it was law, and I just got the absolute bug for it. So there you go. So and then I applied to university. I took a year out and went to work for a year. I didn't have the money to go right to Thailand or whatever, like some people do, but I got a proper job and I worked for a year, and I enjoyed that, and I got a lot of experience at working in a sort of commercial environment. And then I went to Manchester University, and then from then continued right the way through until I qualified, and obviously the rest is history, so to speak.
Wow, that's an interesting route into the law, which is so important for people to know when I ask you later on about diversity in our profession. But why did you go into crime?
Well, specifically, I mean, that was the thing. I think like most people who watch TV and see barristers in our wigs and our gowns, it's always criminal cases. I mean, you don't really see, complex chancery cases or your civil trials in front of a judge. It's always a jury trial. And at 16/17, I'd watched Crown Court as a kid, probably bunking off school, watching it in the daytime. But I'd watched Crown Court as a kid, and I think, as I say, like most people, I didn't think to go to the county court. I thought I'm going to go to the place where they do jury trials. And as I said, I watched a drugs trial, I watched a bit of a murder trial, and it just seemed like it was like being in telly, being inside a TV show, but it's real and much more dramatic and much more important. So I just fell in love with the whole thing. And, as you probably gathered, because I've been rabbiting on your podcast, but I do like to talk. And I thought that, criminal law gives you the chance to cross-examine witnesses, to make speeches, to be a bit dramatic. And maybe the acting side does come out of it sometimes for all of us in crime. So it just fitted my personality, and it fitted the sort of the stuff that I was passionate and interested about. And from that moment of going into that very first Crown Court, at the age of 17, I never looked back. There was nothing else that I could possibly have wanted to do with my life other than be a criminal advocate.
Yes. Now, you have a breadth of cases, as you alluded to, from celebrity clients to, vulnerable people. And you've become, somewhat of a commentator on the law. You've been involved in a television program. You've got a book coming out. But I wonder, along your route, did you have any role models or mentors or sponsors?
Yeah, so 2 different issues there. So far as role models are concerned, I mean, when I was a teenager, so particularly when I got into sixth form and I was really kind of engaged, I did politics A-level, and I got interested in sort of politics and policy and so on. And I can remember that Michael Mansfield at the time was a very sort of famous and at the time fairly young lawyer, a radical lawyer representing sort of people who were on the margins and often the more unpopular characters like your IRA terror suspects and the like, and he was always on Question Time. And I remember thinking, this is someone who's a real role model, because he was standing up for people who had no one else to speak for them, unpopular people, as I say, and that appealed to me. And of course, there's other kind of even more famous people like Nelson Mandela, who was a lawyer and a radical lawyer and in his own right, and ended up, of course, serving a long time in prison for his beliefs, and it was these characters. I guess it was the sort of countercultural kind of lawyers, those who stood up against the status quo, stood up against the system, and perhaps advocated causes that were less popular with the public. And that, for some reason, appealed to me. I always kind of have a little bit of a sympathy for the underdog. I mean, I had, even when I was at school, I remember if someone was being bullied, I'd be the one. I was quite big, I was quite tall, and I would say, look, kind of leave it out, and that kind of. So I guess anyone that stood up for people, the underdog, were the people that I would be most kind of admiring of. And Michael Mansfield certainly stood out in the UK, and people like Nelson Mandela in sort of world terms. And of course, at the time, he was still in prison. So those are two sort of big sort of role models, heroes who were lawyers. And I know Nelson Mandela's not nowadays not known as much for his legal career in the 50s and 60s as he is for his political sort of role later on in South Africa. But he was a massive hero and still is. And in fact, I've got Nelson Mandela's handprint signed by Nelson Mandela on the wall in my house. So because he is such an important figure to me, and I just love his voice.
Wow. Oh, you must be one of the rare people. I think my parents used to make us write letters for him to be freed. I remember as a child.
Yeah, I was part of the campaign at Manchester University. It was still free Nelson Mandela back in the late 80s, before he was actually freed. Yeah, I remember it well.
Amazing. Wow. Well, that actually takes me slightly nicely then to sort of the role of lawyers and barristers in society. And I really wanted to ask you really about, you've got a huge Twitter following. You're quite comfortable on Twitter, as some of my guests on this podcast are, and you're not afraid to comment on legal topics. You're not afraid to go on 5 Live to comment on things. How did all that happen? And then I want you to tell us a bit about the book and the TV show.
So they're all connected. So around about 2 or 3 years ago, I met, through a friend of mine, Adrian Chiles, the broadcaster and BBC radio presenter, and we were out for a pint one night, and we got talking about law and the state of the justice system. As lots of people know, particularly because the Secret Barrister book has obviously made people aware of a lot of the problems in the system. And Adrian and I got chatting over a couple of pints, and he said, look, this is fascinating. I don't think people understand this. People know that this is going on, how bad it was in the criminal justice, and still is. And he said, will you come on my 5 Live show and talk about this? So I said, yeah, of course I will. Because I'm very passionate, as you say, Sally, about the system and about the fact that it lets so many people down, victims as well as defendants, as well as witnesses, all sorts of people, and the rest of us. It lets down society as a whole. So I went on Adrian's program, and we did a 30-minute plus extended interview on the state of criminal justice. And it was picked up by a lot of the media, picked it up, and and they were interested. I then ended up meeting, through Adrian, a producer at BBC Television called Paul Connolly, who heads up a lot of factual program at the BBC, and he was really fascinated and passionate about criminal justice. And he said, "Why don't we do a series?" So we ended up pitching the show to BBC One, and they picked it up very quickly, and we ended up, as you know, making a 5-part documentary series called "Crime: Are We Tough Enough?" which is still on iPlayer, by the way, if you want to have a watch. Then, so getting on to how the other stuff happened and the Twitter and so on, then I wrote a couple of articles about subjects that I was really passionate about, including drug legalization, which I'm a big advocate of because of my sort of very strong view that drug prohibition is massively damaging to many communities and also causes untold costs and wasted time in the criminal justice system. So I wrote a piece about that for The Spectator, which they immediately agreed to publish, and it went out. It was actually a cover piece, maybe a year or so, just over a year ago. Well, that article was then seen by an editor at Bloomsbury, who famously published Harry Potter. Hopefully, I can outsell her. We'll see. But I got an email from an editor who's now my editor saying, "We're really interested in some of your ideas. They're quite radical. They're interesting. Have you thought about a book?" I hadn't at the time. I was just sort of playing around with the TV stuff and writing some media articles and so on. And then within about a month of that, they commissioned what is now Justice on Trial, which comes out in July and is already pre-ordered, available on Amazon for pre-order, and is already getting quite a number of pre-orders and moving up the Amazon rankings 3 months before it even comes out. So all of it happened because of a chance meeting with Adrian Chiles, and we had a pint.
Wow.
And I didn't finish the answer about social media. So basically, as soon as you start doing TV and writing, I now have a publicist, and they kind of say, look, you need to have a social media presence. That's very important for books. It's very important for promoting TV shows and stuff like that. And also it's given me the opportunity, as you say, to make some of the points, particularly on Twitter. You can make points very quickly and directly. You can react to events. And I also take my approach to social media is once again a bit like I was talking about before, about how I like the sort of counter narrative, people who are standing up against the status quo. I just feel that the media often just takes a very simplistic party line to so many issues. And now that we've got Twitter, and now that we've got other social media, some of us who perhaps say, okay, let's just think about this more carefully than just assuming that, the whole narrative, for example, around sentences are too short, they've been going down. They haven't. They've been going up and up and up for 20 years. They're longer than ever. We've got 80-odd thousand people in prison, higher than ever. And yet the media reports it as judges are soft, everything's soft. So I'm using social media to try and put some of that truth back into the public domain. Whether it makes any difference, who knows? But hopefully the book will, because some of the points are made in the book in much more detail, of course, with all the evidence to back it up.
Well, I'll invite you back on once the book's out, because as I say, I've not got a copy yet.
We'll get you one. Well, it's very kind of you to pre-order one. I'll get you a press copy as well, so you can read it before July. How's that?
Oh, wonderful!
But don't cancel your order, though.
I just wanted to ask you: do you have a case that's really impacted on your life, or a really memorable case?
Yeah, I mean, I do deal in some of my sort of cases are fairly high profile and made the news, and I do deal with some of them in the book and give sort of accounts of in some detail. And there's one case in particular that I talk about in detail in the book. Was I represented a young man 20 years ago called Tunde Adatoro, who went on a shooting spree in Rochdale and shot 5 people. It was a very dramatic case. It was a high security trial. It got a lot of publicity. And it was a case when I was only at the maybe 6 years or so qualified call at the time. So it's quite, I obviously had a leading counsel, a silk leading me in a case of that seriousness. But that was a case that was just so intrinsically fascinating. And of course, the human interest of a case where people have just been shot at point blank range in the street. And fortunately, none of them died. It was just a miracle. But that was a case that really impacted me quite heavily in terms of, and it advanced my career as well. I mean, one of the things I think that perhaps those who don't really understand how criminal law and criminal lawyers work is, to most people, the idea of defending someone who's shot several people at point blank range, just members of the public, would find that whole idea quite awful. But to criminal law, someone who's got criminal law in their blood, you actually have a passion for those really serious cases and the really kind of difficult cases where actually everyone's entitled to a defense, even someone who, in that case, had been seen on video. I mean, there was the helicopter was filming the whole thing, been seen on video shooting people. So it was a really, really important case in my career. It moved my career from sort of a reasonable level of success for my level of call. Suddenly I was up into a really high profile case that was on the national news. And then after that, my practice definitely increased in size, and also the nature of the case I was doing was much more serious, much more complicated. And I went on then to spend the next almost 15 years doing almost exclusively complex organised crime cases, large drugs conspiracies, murder cases, very large fraud, financial crime cases. And then it ended up doing the largest ever trial for police corruption in the UK, which was another massive sort of case for me in my career. The trial lasted over 6 months. There were 10 defendants. It was all to do with a murder back in the late 80s and a alleged conspiracy amongst police officers to fit up innocent men who ended up going to prison for murder and then were released on appeal. So a fascinating case, human interest case. And it was that case where I finished that case and realised now's the time to apply for silk. I made an application within a month or so of finishing that case and was successful first time round. So that was a huge case for my career, big impact. And I have no doubt was the bedrock of my silk application.
Absolutely. Well, let me just ask you there then. You are now very senior.
It makes me feel old when you say it like that. Can we say very experienced?
Very experienced.
I haven't got my bus pass yet.
Well, the trouble is, if you're not silk, you're just referred to as a senior junior.
No, that's very true.
Now you're silk. I'll just say you're very experienced senior.
Very silky.
Suppose the question is about diversity in our profession. I am a Black woman. I'm 20 years cool. And, I'm passionate about gender, social mobility, race. Really, I'm passionate about just improving the makeup of the profession so that we look a bit more like the people we represent and the society before us. And I wonder what views you've got about that. What ways can we improve, the diversity in our profession?
Yeah, well, that's something that I'm really passionate about because, as you say, we do still have underrepresentation in a number of groups, including state educated people, whatever, regardless of race. State education is still disproportionately underrepresented at the bar, and there are many other kind of diversity issues, and that's something I'm really passionate about. So not only have I, over the years, tried to, as part of my role in chambers, I certainly remember encouraging, for example, mature applicants from non-traditional backgrounds as part of my kind of responsibilities when I became involved in pupillage decisions. But I also interview for scholarships for Gray's Inn, part of the interview panels for the scholarships. And I have always sought, I'm not going to give away sort of the internal stuff that goes on, but I've always sought to advocate for scholarships to be those who need the money and who are in groups that are most underrepresented. So, disabled applicants, ethnic minority applicants, and state school applicants, rather than giving scholarships to those who don't need the money. I think that's an important part of it. But the truth of it, Sally, in my opinion, is that the bar has still gone nowhere near far enough. We are still dramatically underrepresented in terms of certain groups. And the only way I see through that is for the bar as a whole to adopt a different approach to the assessment of candidates, particularly for pupillage. Because for me, the difficulty is this. Most sets, particularly the more prestigious sets, place an enormous emphasis on pure academic achievement. So A-level grades, degree classification, and the institution at which the degree was taken. So somebody who's got a first-class degree from Oxford and a bunch of A's at A-level and loads of A-stars at GCSE, they are at the top of the pile. And their chances are 10 times higher than a non-traditional candidate from a state school background who maybe struggled with their GCSEs and even their A-levels and maybe got a 2-2 in their degree. They may be equally intellectually able. And in fact, the candidate with the perhaps lesser academics may be a much more rounded candidate. They might have much more life experience. They may, as you say, you want a number of lawyers, you want a good cohort of lawyers who look and sound like the people they represent, rather than talk down to them. And of course, there are many very able criminal lawyers who went to public school and who had very wealthy backgrounds. Many of them very, very good at what they did. But the point is that the reason why a public school educated white male who goes to one of the top public schools, the reason why they are so much more likely to get into chambers as a pupil is because they from day one have been hothoused educationally to achieve those specific milestones. GCSEs, A-levels, get into Oxbridge, get a first or a high 2-1. Whereas those like you and me who perhaps come from more ordinary backgrounds and went to state schools, really the teachers just want to make sure you don't bunk off. So then if they keep you at school, that's an achievement. If you can get a high attendance record. So obviously, as I said to you earlier, I didn't actually do that well in my O-levels because no one was paying attention to what I was doing. It wasn't because I wasn't able. I could have got the same grades if I'd been to one of those other schools. But the fact is that chambers do not make allowances for the difference in educational inputs that each of the applicants has received. So my answer to that is a simple one. Value-added assessment of grades, which means you look at the school and the average grades for that school, and you place the candidate against that average. So someone from Eton, where the average is everyone gets A's anyway, they're no better off than someone who gets B's in a school where everyone gets D's. In fact, they're worse off because overachieving within your environment is much more impressive than simply achieving the average at a very high standard where you are injected with education from the moment you kind of almost come out of the womb, as many who go to the best private schools are. So we at the bar, there are brilliant algorithms, there are brilliant software programs, brilliant services around that can say you take Sally or you take Chris, you look at the average result from their school, where do they sit? Are they above or below the average? If they're above, how much above? And if you're 50% above the average for your school, you're pretty bright. If you're 20% below, but you've still got great grades, you've just been given lots and lots of help. And I would always want someone who's overachieved within their environment rather than someone who's underachieved in a much more elite environment where they're given so many opportunities. So I think we have to absolutely look at, forget about the raw grades, forget about how many A's and if it's a first and if it's Oxbridge, and look at the achievement relative to average in your environment. And if we start doing that, suddenly you'll find this huge pool of talent from the inner city communities that are underrepresented at the bar, from many, many comprehensive schools that are dramatically underrepresented at the bar. Suddenly that pool of talent, once people as well realise and have the aspiration they can do it, because we are going to actually give them a pupillage, then suddenly I think we'd see that makeup, the social mobility and the ethnic makeup and the diversity of the bar actually start moving a bit further in the right direction.
Interesting. Well, I want to ask you about two controversial subjects, if I may. Number one is why you believe in legalization of drugs. And secondly, really your view on, because we are in COVID-19 lockdown, what do you think about jury trials? Scotland's thinking of abandoning jury trials. And for us to do trial virtually with juries, do you think fairness can really be achieved?
Okay, so virtual jury trials. I mean, I think this is just one of those chip paper stories that's going to come and go, because during this period there've been lots of talk of different things, and if we've been in lockdown for years and that kind of thing. I suspect it won't be anything like as dramatic as perhaps some have predicted. We're already starting to see the signs that maybe that will change. But the reality is you can't have remote jury trials. It's just ridiculous, because jury trials are, first of all, they are fundamental to our constitution. So the idea, and have been for almost 1,000 years, and there's a whole chapter in my book about jury trials and how important they are, how we've come to have the system that we have, and why it's been exported to the States and many other countries around the world. Because it's what it is, in my view, putting witnesses within the eyesight of the 12 jury members and allowing the 12 jury members to deliberate as we do in private, in a private room, is the most effective way of achieving a just and fair verdict that has been devised by the human species. I don't think there's any other system, and I've studied them in part in research for my book, but I don't think there's any other system that works as effectively as our English jury system, as practiced in other countries. And the reason for that, as I always say in every closing speech to a jury, members of the jury, the reason why that witness box is directly opposite you, the jury, is because you, the jury, then can make the best possible judgment of whether you're being told the truth or being told a pack of lies. And you can't do that by video. You just can't do it. Of course, we have video witnesses who give their evidence on video link, but that's a very different thing. That's usually one witness out of an entire trial.
Absolutely. I wonder if I can ask you then about drugs.
Sure. Any criminal lawyer will have spent a considerable part of his or her career dealing with cases that have some connection to drugs. So I would say my experience is that the majority of cases have some connection to drugs, partly because my practice over the years has involved serious drugs conspiracy cases and the like, but it's also because I've been involved in murder cases where people have been murdered because of drugs, either because people are on them or because there is a dispute about them and who's going to be allowed to sell them and where. We know that the great majority of the murders of young people, we've seen so many shootings and stabbings on our streets over the last couple of years, almost all of those have some connection to gangs, and those gangs principally deal in drugs. There are other forms of criminal activity, but it's the major form of criminal activity in this country. So when I was, looking into the book, and prior to that writing other articles that I told you about this subject, I looked at the economic impact of drug prohibition. Because, of course, they had prohibition of alcohol in the States. They tried it for 10 years or so, and it was a total disaster. And it led to the proliferation of organised crime gangs. It led to the untold misery that now is the prohibited drug trade, which was driven largely initially by the US. But the absolutely crystal clear evidence is that the prohibition of drugs leads to more deaths because of drugs, leads to more crime because of drugs. Just think about the obvious. If you have to pay the price, a black market price for heroin, which is for most users between £200 and £300 a week, but it can be more. Drug users do not have £200 or £300 a week, so they have to find it from somewhere. And how do they find it? They either sell drugs themselves or they commit other crimes against members of the public, robberies of mobile phones, stealing from people's houses, or exploiting women or others for sexual gain. So basically, the long and short of it is that I have absolutely no doubt that the prohibition of drugs, not drugs themselves, but the prohibition of drugs, is responsible for most crime in our society, most harm in our society, most deaths as a result of crime, and also, sadly, I mean, one of the people I interviewed for my book was a woman called Anne-Marie Coburn, whose daughter died of an ecstasy overdose at the age of, I think she was 15. I hope I'm right about that. But she had gone out and bought 93% pure MDMA powder from a dealer, not knowing that pure meant bad. She thought that pure meant good, because pure means there's no additives. Her name was Martha. She took enough ecstasy to kill 10 grown men. Would that have happened if ecstasy was available as a licensed product, a known dosage with the exact strength written on the box at the point of sale in the way that alcohol is sold? I don't believe that, and neither does her mother. And many of these overdose deaths, of which there are thousands up and down the country every year, come about purely because dealers do not have quality control. They will put anything by way of additives, but also they have no way of knowing. If you buy a £10 bag of heroin, it might be 5% pure or it might be 15. So you have no idea. And you might well inject a particularly strong batch of heroin. And sadly, this happens all too often. It's not a suicide attempt. They just don't know what they're taking. They are putting a liquid made from powder into their veins with absolutely no clue how much heroin or other drug, amphetamine, or whatever it is that they're injecting into them. So my take on it is that we should look at a welfare model for drugs. And I travelled to Switzerland as part of my book research and spent some time with their licensed heroin supply clinics out there. And the health of those who use heroin, their life chances. There is hardly any street crime associated with drug dealing there because they've kind of decriminalized it unofficially, as it happens. But I have no doubt that if you had a licensed and legalized model, we would see 50% reduction in crime and a 50% reduction in the prison population and probably an 80% reduction in drug overdose deaths. And for me, that's much more important than ridiculous moralizing about whether it's right or wrong to take drugs, but usually by people who are quite happy to sip whiskey or vodka or some other legal and licensed product that already exists. So I'm very passionate, and it's not because I want to be soft on drug dealers or criminals. It's because I want to get rid of them altogether, and they'll be gone.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting viewpoint because there is a contrary view to that, which is actually we'll have more people as addicts and more deaths because they'll have more access. So,
well, that's a contrary view that's disproven by all the evidence from all the countries that have decriminalised or freed up the supply of Class A drugs, as we would call them, like heroin and crack and other drugs like that. All of them, and Portugal's the prime example, but there are others, all seen a reduction in usage. But more importantly than the usage levels is the harm levels. So the amount of associated crime, the amount of health damage and overdose all go down when you legalise and license. And the more you legalise and license, the lower the rates of crime, the lower the rates of drug-related death. So that's the evidence from every country that's experimented with a degree of liberalisation or decriminalisation, is that they don't change their minds after a year or two and say, oh, do you know, we've made a mistake because and look at all this terrible problem we've created. Not one country that has decriminalised to some extent or licensed the supply of drugs to some extent, none of them have ever reverted course back to the original prohibition. Why is that? Because it worked and because it did have the desired impact. But none of them are perfect. The perfect model for me is complete licensing and complete regulatory supply chains. So I'm not talking about just letting drug dealers off. You wouldn't be allowed to sell drugs any more than you're allowed to sell alcohol without a license. You can't start selling booze without a license. You wouldn't be able to sell drugs without a license. You'd have to go to a licensed dispensary. You'd have to obviously make yourself aware of the health impacts, sign a form saying I understand all this to get a supply, but it would definitely improve the lifetime. I saw it myself in Geneva when the people were coming into a licensed clinic to get heroin twice a day, and they were given a secure room, a safe, a hygienic room to take their heroin in, and they were given a measured and precise quantity of heroin, and they were given access to doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, rehab if they wanted to have rehab and come off the drugs, and 80% of them come off through that clinic. But 80% of street heroin users don't come off it. Almost none do in our current system.
Yes, well, it'll be interesting to see, what our listeners think about that, because it is a controversial.
Absolutely, I get that.
Yeah. But Chris, you have so many passions. I wanted to ask you about well-being. You've got 4 children, 2 of them young.
Yeah, 8 and 5.
Yeah. And so I wonder, what do you do for your well-being? Because burnout is high at the bar. We know the retention's great, particularly at the publicly funded work that we do. And so what do you do to try and relax?
It's a good question, and it's something I've done. One of my videos on the YouTube channel was about this subject, because I've been as bad as most lawyers over the years, and certainly in my first 10 years or so, I gave no thought to well-being, because I was young. You're 23, 24. You literally, like any 23, 24-year-old, you might be a barrister, but you think you're kind of immune to kind of anything like stress or pressure, and you think you can stay up drinking all night and still be fine the next day. But as I kind of matured, and I turned 50 in January, I guess that was a little bit of a milestone for me, as it is for many people. And I think I do exercise a lot more than I ever did, probably since before I even came to the bar. I mean, last time I exercised the amount I do now, I would have probably been a student, played a lot of football and basketball and stuff. So I think physical fitness is really important to me. I make sure that I try and get breaks in a way that I didn't in my young. I would work 7 days a week for months on end. That is deeply unhealthy, and actually it's deeply inefficient. I think it makes you less able to get stuff done in a sensible time frame when you're overtired and overstrained. I did take a year out from practice. I'd been at the bar 12 years, and I had worked in the way that I've just described, which was relentless, non-stop. And I'd take the odd week here and there, but I didn't really take sort of proper holidays, and I do that now, and I think that's really important. But yes, after about 12 years, I think I was in danger of getting to the point where I was kind of burnt out by it. I was a bit a lot of the cases I was doing all seemed to blend into one. I'd do one case when another one had either not even just finished, or they were right. I'd finish on a Friday after a 2-3 month case, take no time off, and immediately start another case. And that I don't think is very healthy. I mean, sometimes nowadays, sadly, it's necessary because there've been such big cuts, as you know, in fees for the sorts of cases I did in those days. But I think I'd got to the point where if I hadn't taken a break from the law, and I went off and started a business with a friend of mine, and I spent a year working and running a business that had nothing to do with the law. If I hadn't done that, and I came back after that, absolutely refreshed and ready for action, and I actually started a big drugs conspiracy trial on the very first day back after that 13 months out of court. And it was brilliant. I loved it. It was like being back on a bike, but with new energy and a fresh approach. And I came back committed to taking silk within 5 or 6 years, which I managed to do. So I think breaks. I think having the odd sabbatical to do something different along the way, maybe every 10 years or so, if people can find a way to spend a month or two to do something else, to get to clear your head a little bit, I think that's really helpful. I do think physical fitness and keeping and diet and stuff like that are absolutely critical. And then you can easily end up eating rubbish because you work through to a silly time and eat a load of chocolate or eat whatever. We've all done it, and I've done it many, many times. Just eat loads of takeaways because and stuff like that. So I think looking after yourself that way, but also massively important is to look after your mental health and well-being mentally. So that for me meant I did started doing things like the Headspace, where you kind of just sit and you just put your headphones on and try and just take a bit of a time out where you can take a breath and usually whatever you do, anything you do as a break, whether it's physical exercise or just say some sort of headspace or just go for a walk or whatever, and clear your head and stop work for half an hour in the course of a 12-hour working day that often we have to do. Anything like that, I think, helps you to sustain yourself in the long term, just as it does your body. If you're relentless with your body, it's going to break down. If you're relentless with your mind, it's going to eventually kind of come into problems. So take breaths, take breaks, and look after yourself physically and mentally. And I just think that makes an enormous difference. And take time with your family. Take time to see your friends. I know lots of people in our profession lose track completely with their friends. They don't see them from one year to the next because they're always too busy. Friends text you, I can't make it. I've got a trial the next day. Try not to get into that habit of constantly putting work for everything. I mean, everything, as many of us done. I've done it, massive hypocrite, because over the 26 years, I've probably done it for at least 2/3 of the time. I've fallen into exactly the trap that I'm trying to kind of lecture people not to fall into. But it's because I've made those mistakes that I can kind of say confidently that you shouldn't do that. You need to, even at your beginning, when you think you've got to prove yourself to everyone and you're chasing every brief, because there's only so many briefs to go around. If you're 1 or 2 or 3 years cool, just still just go for a bike ride. Just take an afternoon off, and also pretty common sense, but try and limit the booze a little bit. I know lots of people in our job do drink a lot and every night. It's nothing to do with being a lawyer. It's just common sense. I mean, we've all drifted into that. Well, not all of us, but many of us have drifted into that habit of going to the pub every night or meeting people. It's always worth trying to just have a bit of time off the booze and get yourself, feeling good about yourself physically, and you'll be a much better lawyer and hopefully a much better sort of to your friends and family as well as a result.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, Chris, I wondered if you got a favourite fictional lawyer and perhaps a favourite book?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I was thinking about this, that my sort of favourite book, and the book that always comes into my head when I think about my favourite book is The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe, which of course was made into a film as well. And I remember reading that, but it's a brilliant book because I love Tom Wolfe's writing anyway, but it's so real. But the book is about a guy who's from a very sort of wealthy sort of investment banker type, earning $1 million a year, etc., back in the 80s, who has a hit and run and ends up in the justice system as a defendant, and having come from this very privileged kind of Manhattan world. And it becomes a big kind of criminal case. And I just found the whole thing absolutely fascinating. This kind of two worlds collide idea that you have this guy who's very privileged, who then ends up having to sort of defend himself in the criminal courts amongst all of what he would see as lesser individuals and criminals there. I'm not one of them. But actually, it's a great read anyway, but it makes the point that all of us actually are only that far away. We're only one turn of our wheel on the car. We're one, mistake away from potentially ending up in a criminal court as a defendant. I love that book. And I love that message because I think lots of people see the criminal justice system as about others, about some other kind of people that are not like us. And of course, the main character in Bonfire of the Vanities very much has that view until he realizes, oh, actually, I need a good lawyer. I need to get some justice. I need some help here. And so I just think everybody, law students, should read that book. In terms of characters, I do have a favourite character, but sadly, unlike my real life heroes like Nelson Mandela, he's not in that category of someone that you'd aspire to be, or maybe he is in some fantasy land, because probably my favourite fictional movie character is a character called Martin Vale, who was the lawyer played by Richard Gere in a film called Primal Fear, where he was the top defense lawyer, I think, in Chicago. And he was very wealthy and he defended wealthy people charged with murder and this and that. And he ends up defending a character played by Ed Norton for a murder. It's a psychological thriller. I won't give it away. But Martin Vale, he comes up with one of the great lines, which is, it sounds very cynical, but it's true. And he's asked in an interview by a journalist at the beginning of the film, when he's describing how he uses all these clever legal tricks to win cases. And the journalist turns around to him and asks the question that we often get asked as criminal defense lawyers. And the question that he's asked is, what about the truth? And Martin Vale's response, without hesitation, is, the only truth that matters is the truth I create in the minds of the 12 men and women of the jury. And that's a very deeply cynical line. But actually, when you think about it, it's not far off the truth about criminal cases, whether we like it or not. What matters is not the truth in reality, but what the jury believe. He's a great actor, and it's just a great thriller with a really good twist at the end, which I won't give away if people have not watched it. But yeah, he's my favourite character, not because he's particularly likable, but because I think he a lot of his character is this sort of very high profile, very kind of successful criminal defense lawyer in America. A lot of what we look at in him and say, oh, we don't really like the look of that, is actually pretty fundamental to the system, which is being prepared to fight every case without fear or favour and doing our absolute best for our client, whoever they are. And that message comes across in the film, even though he is often fighting for people who perhaps arguably don't deserve it as much because they're rich and maybe they have done wrong. But it makes the point. It doesn't matter who your client is. And I've acted for, international footballers who are multimillionaires, and I've acted for homeless people who've been charged with murder. And, literally everyone in between, billionaires I've acted for. And every single client I approach identically. And it's listen to what they have to say and do my absolute best to get the outcome that they are hoping for. And generally, in my case, because I'm a defense lawyer, that's to be acquitted or to get a lenient sentence. But yeah, great film. Everyone should watch, particularly law students, because again, you learn a lot from fictional lawyers.
Absolutely. God, I could keep talking to you forever. But can I ask you this then, just on that point about being a defense lawyer? Did you ever prosecute?
No.
When did you make the decision to then only be the voice for the other side, if I may say so? And would you ever go back?
Well, it's interesting. I didn't make a decision to be a defense lawyer as such. I was, didn't come from the best sort of educational, etc. background. Therefore, I wasn't really going to ever get pupillage at one of the sort of main prestigious sets for many of the reasons I was talking about earlier when we were talking about recruitment to the bar. And so I got pupillage in a very small set with only, I think, about 8 or 10 tenants. And my set only did criminal defense. That was the place I got pupillage. And, I was incredibly lucky and grateful to get pupillage very soon after I started pupillage, within a few weeks of finishing the what was then the bar vocational course. And I was very lucky and felt very, very grateful and honoured to have got pupillage. And many then weren't getting pupillage, but now, of course, it's so many more. So it just so happened that my initial exposure in practice, and I did as everyone does, my first 6 following my pupil supervisor or pupil master as he was at the time, watching him do criminal defence, and I found it very interesting. And then in second 6, I did back-to-back trials, mostly magistrates, but 1 or 2 Crown Court trials, all defence, because that was all my chambers did. And so within a year or two, I'd begun to build a defence practice, because that's what my chambers did. They didn't do any prosecution. So when it came to, I did eventually move sets, because my chambers kind of folded after a few years, and I joined a much larger, much more prestigious set where they did do prosecution. But as you probably know, I don't know if it's still the case, I think it's still the case, but you have to start as a prosecutor at level 1 and move up the scale. So by that stage, I was doing level 4 work as a defence advocate. If I'd elected to do prosecution, I would have had to start doing committals for sentence and stuff like that, which I hadn't done for several years because my practice was jury trials exclusively, and usually quite serious jury trials. So it was really a question of, I'm not going to go backwards in time and start doing really low level work. As it happened, just as a sort of weird aside, I did actually go through the process of applying for the various grades for prosecutor. And I got to grade 4, which is the top, having never prosecuted a case. So I don't know what that says about the system at the time, but I was at the top level of a junior prosecutor as a grade 4, having literally never prosecuted a single case. And I have presented cases in the misconduct arena as effectively as the prosecutor on behalf of police forces and so on. So, and if in the highly unlikely event now that the prosecution came to me and said, will you prosecute this case for us, Mr. Daw? Well, if my diary was free, I would do it. So I'm not actually sort of, as it were, ethically or somehow politically attached to defending. It's just that's how my practice went from the beginning. And I was lucky enough, I mentioned that huge case I did at 6 or 7 years called the mass shooting case. When you start getting cases like that, and the alternative to 2-3 month complex conspiracy cases, and the prosecution is saying, will you go and do a shoplifting trial for us? It makes no sense. So that's the only reason. So anyway, any prosecutors out there who've got a nice juicy case for me, then you know where I am.
It's interesting what you say about the system, because, of course, I know many barristers who prosecute day in, day out, and they're rejected for reaching the category 4. So there is something about the system, and, of course, some barristers make that decision. There are many in my own chambers. It's not the case for me. I prosecute and defend, but who ethically do not prosecute, and they've made that decision.
I don't really agree with that as a concept, because ethically, you should be prepared to advocate whatever cause you're asked to advocate. We're not there to make decisions about the morality of our clients' actions, whether it be a prosecutor or a defense lawyer. We're there to advocate as best we can, and in fact, we're duty bound to do that. And I think there's a real conflict for me between our kind of cab rank rule and the obligation to take cases that are given to you, and making a personal, ethical, or moral judgment that you're only prepared to act for one side. I don't agree with that, and I can see why people's practice, as mine, end up being defence-based, because that's the work you're exposed to. But I think if you're asked to do a case that's within your competence for the prosecution, then I think it's tricky to see how you can say I'm not doing it on ethical grounds, because I don't see how you reconcile that with the code of conduct.
There are people who just say, well, I'm only defending. I prosecuted once. I didn't like it. I'm not going to. So, yeah, it's a different argument. So, Chris, you do a lot, as I do, really, outside our daily practice. You've got a much more glamorous and complicated practice probably than me, than most of the bar. You mentor for the Bar Council. scholarship decision is a great in, my in. And I wonder what's next for you. Might the bench, I notice you don't sit yet as a recorder, a baby judge, as we in the profession would know. Is there a plan for progressing?
I don't have any intention or desire to go on the bench for the simple reason that if I did, then I couldn't do the campaigning work I do. I couldn't write the books that I write. I couldn't make the television programs that I make about justice reform, because as a judge, you have to be seen to be politically impartial. So I couldn't become a judge now because my kind of media and writing activities are inconsistent with being a judge. And also, to be perfectly frank, I mean, I'm involved not only do I make documentaries, and I'm looking at making more documentaries about criminal justice, but I'm involved at the moment in a drama project, making potentially a large kind of big budget TV drama as an executive producer. And you can't do this range of activity whilst sitting full time as a judge. There's just no way I'd have the time to do any of it. And I am really enjoying this stage of my career. I settled into Silk after 7 years, and I've got a good established practice in Silk across a hugely interesting and diverse range of areas. And I get these opportunities to do media stuff, to do TV, radio, to do, books and journalism. And the judiciary just doesn't allow you that flexibility and that freedom in the way that the bar does. So it's for that reason I'm really happy with where I am, and I don't have any desire to go on the bench. And I'm not sure, for me, after all these years, the idea of being sitting in one courtroom every day, all day, and being stuck with the timings of that and the lack of flexibility, I'm not sure I could cope with it, I'm afraid. But so it's over to you, Sally, on that one.
Yes, well, watch this space. Well, finally, it's been so wonderful talking to you, Chris. I hope you will come back on. But one last question, really. If there were to be a film about your life and your career, who would you like to play you?
Oh, Tom Hardy. Because I mean, I know he's not quite as good looking or as muscular as me. But yeah, he'd probably be all right as a second best. He's literally one of my favourite actors. Love him. And have it being played by, in fact, I'm hoping to cast him. I shouldn't say this, but I'm hoping to cast him in my drama as and when we get it commissioned. Maybe he will play me. Who knows?
Yes.
Well, I'm hoping. I'm gonna not only exec produce but co-write this project, and we've got to get it commissioned yet. So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I'm hoping to make it as realistic and interesting as I can. And as you say, people will find the book, which is Justice on Trial, and it's on Amazon. People will find that there's lots of juicy stuff in there. It's not a dry academic book. It's meant to be an airport read if the airport's ever open again. Anyway.
Yes, well, that'll be really great. Thank you so much for giving up your time.
You're welcome, Sally. It's great to speak to you.
Many thanks to Chris Daw QC. You can find him on Twitter @CrimLawUK. Thank you again for listening to Talking Law with me, Sally Penni. Do connect with me on Twitter @SallyPenny1. We'd love it if more people heard our podcast, so if you could spare just a couple of minutes to leave us a review, that will help people find us. Until the next episode, do check out the latest Women in the Law UK book. It's a look at how far the profession has come in the last 100 years, featuring career and well-being advice from women and men. It's available now on Amazon. Just search for Talking Law by Sally Penni. And don't forget to visit us at womeninthelawuk.com for all the latest news about our organisation. We look forward to connecting with you. Talking Law was produced by Sam Walker and is a What Goes On media production. Bye for now.